Welcome to Chapter 8. This chapter is packed with tips, tricks, and troubleshooting advice to help you refine your physics simulations and solve common issues. Let's dive in. I just want to go over a couple of troubleshooting tips for Blender when it comes to physics simulations. So there's a couple of things you're going to run into, and I just want to make sure that when you do run into them, you know exactly how to handle them. So the very first thing I'm going to go ahead and mention, and we actually mentioned this before, is when you have two cubes or two objects, and you have collisions or some kind of physics going on with them, there's something called surface thickness. And I want to go ahead and add rigid bodies to these to demonstrate. So I'm going to go ahead, click on our bottom cube. I'm going to add a rigid body, and I'll just keep this type as passive. And I want to go ahead and drop down all of these boxes here. And you'll see right here, collision margin. That's super important, and I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to go ahead and add a rigid body to the top here. I'll keep that as active. Now, if I checkbox this and I choose 1 for my margin, all right, and I go ahead and raise this up, press play, notice how the cube stops a little bit above our bottom cube. That's because there's an invisible sort of barrier. This barrier is always going to be calculated by Blender based on what you define. And if you uncheck this, let me go back, let me press play, notice how they'll collide normally. So you don't always need to checkbox this, but let's say you wanted to have an example for something molecular where these objects definitely wouldn't touch until they reached maybe 0.1. Let's go ahead and see what that looks like. And again, there's that 0.1 gap right there, and I'm just adjusting the margin. So think of the margin as an invisible space between your objects. So if you're ever getting weird collisions or you want your collisions to be a little bit different, you're going to want to look at surface thickness and collision margin. That is super important. Now there's another note that I'll mention within this kind of main subject. So I'm going to go ahead and uncheck collision margin. I'm going to go all the way back to frame 0. We're going to play this back. Now you'll notice everything looks fine, and that's because the objects are separate. Sometimes when you're quickly creating your projects, you'll actually be overlapping your objects like this. And I'm going to just show you this example. If I overlap my objects and I press play, let's go ahead and see what happens here. Notice how our other cube kind of flies away, and I'm going to go back to frame 1. Now they're overlapping right now. As soon as I press play, we can't really calculate the physics. Blender sees this overlapping as kind of an issue. And so Blender's goal is to get these cubes as far away from each other as possible, as quickly as possible, because Blender can't calculate how they're going to hit if they're already touching. They're not only already touching, but they're overlapping. So if you ever have this issue, and I'm going to duplicate this a couple more times, let's say that you have a bunch of objects and you just wanted to experiment, and I've done this before, and this is why I know this happens. What's going to happen is as soon as I press play, these objects are going to go flying. And that's why it's really important before you run your simulations to make sure nothing's already touching. Let me go ahead and play this. As you can see, it looks kind of cool. It's kind of a neat effect. So if you're going for that, you're more than welcome to do this. But I wanted to show you this because if you're having issues, right, and you have multiple objects, you're going to have this kind of exploding thing happening. And if you don't want that, I highly suggest you separate your objects, okay, and make sure nothing's touching. And if nothing's touching, you should have a normal simulation just like this. However, if things are touching, you're going to get that exploding. Even right here, if they're just slightly touching on the edge, notice how they kind of separate and move apart. Now, this is actually kind of a nice way that Blender handles this, but this overlapping, this clipping is what it's called in Blender, clipping of these objects, that's going to really mess up your simulation. So if you ever have this happen, remember, make sure your objects are not touching. I promise you, this will save you a lot of trouble in the long run. Blender doesn't handle overlapping objects well. It just doesn't know what to do with them. So that's one of my first tips and tricks.